Welcome. This is part 2 of Guide of the Perplexed. Last week we really just kind of covered the introduction and the epistolary dedicatory, which is a really long way of saying dedicating letter. And that we talked about how these introductory materials sort of point out that this is not a work that was intended for most people to consume, that it is a work that is intentionally muddying some of what it says, that intentionally contradicts itself in a lot of places. And we kind of talked about some possible reasons for that. That one possible reason is Maimonides trying to avoid getting in trouble. And another reason being that he may be trying to provide multiple examples so that people can kind of grasp the concepts in the way they need to grasp them, and in the stage of philosophical inquiry in which they find themselves. And that was really, we covered 18 pages in the kind of standard printed edition of the English translation to Guide of the Perplexed. So we didn't cover a lot of ground. And that's sort of in the nature of studying the Guide of the Perplexed, that you don't cover a lot of ground all at once. We're going to try to cover more ground overall, and to cover more topics. We're not going to even scratch the surface on the full work, because the full work covers a ton of different things within the realm of Aristotelian philosophy and Jewish thought and whatever else. And kind of according to my Kindle reader, because I have these as Kindle books as well, there's 600 odd pages for volume 2, and there's 700 odd pages for volume 1, and you just can't cover everything. So for those who kind of took me up on the suggestion of just buying the Maimonides reader, everything that I've taken for tonight is in the Maimonides reader, because I figured, well, maybe you wanted more than just, the whole Guide of the Perplexed, and you wanted some Mishnah Torah and some of the letters. So everything that I've pulled is from the Maimonides reader, which means that everything I've pulled is stuff that, a few generations of Western scholars have decided is important about the guide. So I'm taking them at their word that it's important. I think we can illustrate a number of points that maybe aren't standard points anyway. So our goals are to examine representative sections of the guide, to gain an understanding of some of the details of Maimonides' thought and approach to Judaism and Jewish texts, and to gain an understanding of important aspects of his thought for the history of Judaism, for humanistic Judaism. And if we manage to get through all the slides, we'll have done all of that. If we don't manage to get through the slides, we will not have done all of that, because a couple of these things are very close to the end. So recapping again, we looked at the structure of the guide, or the lack of it, and what that means for how you're supposed to read the guide and who the audience is and what Maimonides' intent was. We also talked about possible limits to the rationalist label, often applied to Maimonides. We talked about the idea that Maimonides' approach to biblical translation is maybe a counter-tradition to the dominant way in traditional Judaism of interpreting the Bible, which is using Rashi's commentaries. And we talked about some of the contradictions that appear in the guide and why. And to kind of start, we'll start by talking about biblical interpretation, not just because Maimonides says it's important, but because he starts the book with it. So he says in his introduction, the first purpose of this treatise is to explain the meanings of certain terms occurring in books of prophecy. Books of prophecy, when Maimonides uses that phrase, he's talking about the Tanakh. He's talking about the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, and he calls all of that books of prophecy because, from his perspective, they are all the results of prophetic revelation. Some of these terms are equivocal, hence the ignorant attribute them to only one or some of the meanings in which the term in question is used. Others are derivatives and they attribute to them only the original meaning from which another meaning is derived. Others are amphibolious, and we talked about how amphibolious is sort of ambiguous in context, and that was sort of a GRE and not an SAT word. Um, and Maimonides says, I need to explain language because it's going to make sense of texts that don't seem particularly rational or logical. And so Maimonides really does start the Guide of the Perplexed by taking up the issue of language. And he says, you know, this is the first thing I'm going to do is talk about language. And he does. And there's no prologue, there's no anything. He just launches right into the question of, is God human? Like, does God have a form? And so this is the first paragraph. This is the very beginning of the substance of the guide, other than a biblical verse that he's going to cite at the beginning of each of the 3 books. And he says, what does God look like? Image, tselem, and likeness, demut. Okay, so he's now talking about Hebrew words, tselem, which kind of means image to some degree. The modern Hebrew word for camera comes from the same word as tselem here. And likeness, demut. People have thought that in Hebrew language, image denotes the shape and configuration of a thing. This supposition led to the pure doctrine of the corporeality of God on account of his saying, let us make man in our image after our likeness. For they thought that God has a man's form. I mean his shape and configuration. They accordingly believed in it and deemed that if they abandoned this belief, they would give the lie to the biblical text, that they would even make the deity to be nothing at all unless they thought that God was a body provided with a face and a hand. So Maimonides starts right off the bat by saying, people read the biblical text superficially, and they come to wrong conclusions as a result of the superficial reading of the text. They see the word tselem, they see the word demut, and they think these are physical attributes, and therefore God has physical attributes. He says that's not right. He's not kidding about this. So I have on the bottom of this slide this thing that says seriously, and the answer is yes. So Merkava mysticism, which we talked about last time as being kind of the earliest form of mysticism that was functional within rabbinic Judaism. So after the Mishnah, that Merkava mysticism includes a text called Shior Komach. Shior Komach is basically a cataloging of the physical measurements of God. Shior means measure, among other things. So Shior Komach says that God is 236 million parasangs tall. A parasang is a Persian measurement that's about 3.5 miles. So, you know, you do the math, almost 1 billion miles tall. So he's really responding directly to people who really did assign a number as a measurement to the physical size of God. And elsewhere, Maimonides said that Shior Komach should be blotted out of existence. So there's a letter, responsum, I don't know, 117, 107, I don't remember the exact number, where he says, you know, may that writing be erased forever. He really doesn't like the idea that God could be described with physical characteristics. And nevertheless, there is a branch of Jewish mysticism that produced some amount of work trying to figure out measurements. They're getting the measurements from particular ways of reading Song of Songs. So Song of Songs doesn't actually ever come out and say God is 236 million parasangs tall. It's being derived using gematria and, you know, all kinds of numerology. And so there's legitimate question about whether they really meant that. Did they really mean 236 million parasangs tall? Is that right? But Maimonides clearly thinks they mean that and has a problem with it and says, when you say this kind of thing, you've misread the text of the Bible altogether. And he says, I'm going to disprove all of this, but I'm not going to do it yet. Right? So we talked about looking at the introduction that he says, I do things in whatever order I think is appropriate, and you're supposed to read the whole thing and continue to read this whole thing over and over and over and over and over again, and you'll understand more as you study this. So I'm not going to do things in serial order the way you maybe expect it to happen. So he says, but I'm going to disprove this whole physical thing, but not yet, because I'm still busy talking about these words. So he says, now with respect to that which ought to be said in order to refute the doctrine of the corporeality of God and to establish his real unity, which can have no true reality unless one disproves of his corporeality. There's a lot of ITY words here. You shall know the demonstration of all of this from this treatise. However, here in this chapter, only an indication is given with a view to elucidating the meaning of image and likeness. So we also talked about last time that Maimonides said, you know, things get revealed, true meanings of prophecies get revealed in little drips and drabs and flashes, and I'm going to give you a little reference in one place and a little reference in another, just as much as you can handle at the time. So this is keeping in that statement that he's going to just give you a little bit at a time, besides which I'm still busy talking about these Hebrew words. And he says, the problem is neither image nor likeness are really physical words. So he says, look, now I say that in the Hebrew language, the proper term designating the form, i.e. the physical structure of a thing, that is well known among the multitude, namely that form which is the shape and configuration of a thing, is toar. So this is another Hebrew word that means image. And in English, these things are translated pretty freely: image, likeness, appearance. They have overlapping meanings. For us, they had overlapping meanings then too. But he says, the scripture says, beautiful in form, yafet toar, and beautiful in appearance. This is talking about Joseph, by the way. And what form, ta'oro, what is his form? What form is he of? This is from Samuel, 1 Samuel. So he's saying, look, when you want to talk about the physical appearance of a thing in the Torah or in the Tanakh, the word we use isn't the set of words that shows up in Genesis talking about image or likeness. It says those words don't really mean physical appearance. They mean conceptual stuff. When you want to talk about physical appearance, you use the word toar or one of its derivatives. So Maimonides says, look, Genesis doesn't use these words. Genesis does not use the word toar. It uses instead the word tselem and demut, and these are conceptual comparisons, not physical comparisons. So you misread the Torah this way, and you easily come to the conclusion that, yes, God has a form, a physical configuration, but that's not true. So he says, Tselem is never applied this way. Toar is never applied to God, right? So we have these three words, and certain things are never, ever applied to God, and other things are applied conceptually. So the term image is applied to the natural form, I mean to the notion in virtue of which a thing is constituted as a substance and becomes what it is. So not the configuration. He's saying Tselem is not the physical configuration of the thing. Tselem is sort of the, when you look at it, that's how you know that it's a person. When you look at it, that's how you know that it's a chair. The concept of the thing, not the actual thing. It is the true reality of a thing insofar as the latter is that particular being. In man, that notion is that from which human apprehension derives. It is said, you are contemptuous of their image, for contempt has for its object the soul, which is the specific form, not the shape and configuration of the parts of the body. The idea here is, if you hate somebody for who they are, not for the crook in their little finger or something. And as with form tselem, so likeness and demut, he says, as for the term likeness, demut, it is a noun derived from the verb dama, to be like, and it too signifies likeness in respect of a notion. This translation of the Guide of the Perplexed uses the word notion to mean an idea or a concept. I'm not in love with the fact that it uses the word notion, because I think we tend to use notion colloquially to mean, oh, it's just a notion. Selim and Demut, like Plato's ideals, yes and no, and we'll get to that, because that's what you think when you see image up there and he's talking about form. We'll get there. So it too signifies likeness in respect of a notion. So think of this as concept or idea. In the same way it is said, the likeness of the throne, the likeness of this is a verse from Ezekiel, the likeness referred to being in respect of elevation and sublimity, not in respect of a throne's square shape, its solidity, and the length of its legs, as wretched people think. So this is Maimonides looking at the text of the first chapter of Ezekiel, which describes in very exhaustive detail a vision the prophet Ezekiel said he had while he was in the temple of the divine chariot. So he says, oh, I saw this thing with 4 heads and 4 wheels, and it moved in every direction, and there was a face pointing in each direction, so it could move freely, and it was on a throne, and the throne was like this, and the throne was like that. And Maimonides is saying, Ezekiel wasn't really talking about a physical throne. You're not supposed to think that any of this is physical, because all of this otherwise seems incredibly absurd. There are some modern scholars who have tried to diagnose Ezekiel with various forms of psychiatric illnesses. You can't do that through a biblical text, I don't think, but Ezekiel is an interesting guy, and this is a very interesting vision of his. But Maimonides is trying to say, people read this stuff and they take it at face value, and that's the last thing they should be doing, but they don't understand that. And so this stuff, Dama and this Demut and Selim and all this other stuff, this is not physical. So I think I'm going to guess that Baba B is Barry. And then Larry have both pointed to, so in the comments, one of them has said Selim and Demut like Plato's ideals. And then Larry said similar to Ding an sich, like the thing in itself, for those of you who aren't reading Kantian German all the time. Similar to Ding an sich, the thing in itself in Kant. Okay, so Maimonides is mostly an Aristotelian. And Aristotelian philosophers don't, by and large, do the thing that Plato does, right? So Plato has this doctrine of the forms where he thinks that there is this sort of ideal hypostasized thing that, like chairs have an essence, and the essence is chairness, and they share in this essence, and there's a real thing out there somewhere that is like the ideal chair, and everything else shares in the ideal chairness of the chair. It really does, the Plato's Republic really does at some point use a Greek word that basically means chair-ness, right? Having the properties of a chair. Plato thinks these things are real and out there somehow. And Kant means the thing in itself. Aristotle is not quite so doctrinaire about it. He thinks that things have forms. He's not willing to go so far as Plato or Kant in saying there's like a thing to it, and that's how you know, and it's a thing that you could somehow isolate if you could just think your way to it. He keeps the idea of form, but he's not working with it in the same way. Because he says, what do you mean it's out there? Because Plato kind of thinks chairness is out there as a thing in itself. So they're all living in the same general domain. Aristotle just doesn't go that far. Just total philosophy inside baseball, I guess. So this is Maimonides in the first chapter, right? I don't want us to lose track of what's happening and where we are in the text and what's going on. This is Maimonides in the first chapter saying, remember in the introduction how I told you I was going to spend a lot of time talking about how people misunderstand biblical language? This is how I'm starting my book. I was serious about this. And this is why there is this idea that maybe Maimonides is the counter tradition in biblical interpretation to some of these more traditional interpreters, because he really is spending the guide working on biblical interpretation. He refers to biblical texts and rabbinic texts more often than anything else. He just sort of assumes you know Aristotelian philosophy and that kind of thing. And he's saying people misread these texts. And when they misread these texts, you get all kinds of weird conclusions like God has hands and fingers and arms and feet and a body and whatever else, because the text seems literally to say that. But if you really paid attention to the words, you'd know that that's not true. Right? That's really what he's working with here, is that you need to read the Bible the right way, and people don't. And he keeps exploring what people get wrong about biblical language and with the word Elohim. So he says, every Hebrew knew that the term Elohim is equivocal, designating the deity, the angels, and the rulers governing the cities. Okay, so we should stop here, because if you haven't studied enough of the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew, you don't actually know that that's what this means. So Elohim is the word that gets used for God a lot. And it also kind of means the angels. And in the book of Exodus in particular, it talks about Elohim being appointed to make decisions. And the Elohim are appointed to make decisions. They're judges, they're human judges. It's not like Moses grabbed some angels and said, you're gonna make decisions. They're just using this word for judge or local governor. So Maimonides says, look, these words have more than one meaning. Why are you saying in the likeness of God? Right, because that's this verse in Genesis. We're still working with Genesis chapter 1 here. He says, look, Onkelos the proselyte, peace be on him, has made it clear, and his clarification is correct, that in the dictum of Scripture, and you shall be as Elohim, knowing good and evil, the last sense, governors ruling cities, is intended. For he has translated, and you shall be as rulers. Aramaic here is Kuravravin, which literally means like great ones, elevated ones, rulers. When Onkelos when Onkelos wants to refer to God, no matter where it is, Onkelos puts two yuds. So he's always replacing the name of God, and you're supposed to know what that means and what it corresponds to in the text. So Maimonides is pointing out, Onkelos completely changes this word and doesn't use anything related to the word God. The word God in Aramaic is Eloha, depending on your dialect of Aramaic. That's not what's happening here. He's like, nope, this is a secular ruler, Kuravravin, people who have been lifted up from among their peers. What does it mean to be in the image of God in his likeness? For the intellect that God made overflow to man, and that is the latter's ultimate perfection, was that which Adam had been provided with before he disobeyed. It was likewise on account of it he was addressed by God and given commandments, for commandments are not given to beasts and beings devoid of intellect. Okay. We have a very different version of cognitive science than Maimonides did. Maimonides, medieval philosophers, did not have cognitive science at all. They thought that intelligence, that the human intellect was something that overflowed from a universal intellect and then came into you. And so he's saying when God made intellect overflow, that's how you know things. And that's what it means to be in the image of God, is you have an intellect. God is intellect, has intellect. We're going to get to how we can't really talk about God according to Maimonides. But his point is, what makes people in the image or likeness of God is not anything physical. Those words aren't supposed to be physical. Those words are talking about the ability to judge, the ability to discern, look at something and know what's good and what's bad. And the having of intellect, of intelligence, of the ability to reason. Animals don't have the ability to reason. Maimonides said people do. That's the resemblance. And then Genesis goes on to talk about how Adam and Eve's eyes open and they realize that they're naked and they're ashamed. And Maimonides says, what, you thought they couldn't see before? Of course they could see before. Their eyes didn't open. This is figurative too. So he's looking at this text that we look at today and say, this is all very difficult to believe. And he says, you're right, it is difficult to believe because that's not what any of this means. I'm going to completely reframe the biblical text for you here to explain what it is people get wrong and how you can interpret it correctly. And I'm only going to give you hints. I am not going to pull apart the entire Tanakh for you this way. I'm giving you hints, I'm giving you flashes so that you can see how to do this interpretation yourself, because you're smart enough to be reading this document, right? He is assuming that we are, as readers, people who have been thoroughly trained up in Jewish law and in Torah, and thoroughly trained up in philosophy, as philosophy existed at the time, so that we can now understand this. We need to see this because we're starting to think that maybe philosophy is right and Judaism is wrong, and he's trying to provide a thing to help you resolve your perplexity, confusion. That's what Maimonides is getting at with this opening couple of chapters, and it's what he's going to do throughout the book. He comes back around to Aristotelian philosophy and all kinds of other things, but he's always coming back to biblical texts and rabbinic texts and saying, no, what this really means is. So the upshot is that the guide is engaged in philosophy, but heavily engaged in providing ways to understand the Tanakh to work for a philosophically sophisticated reader. Maimonides knows that the language of the Tanakh is problematic, and he is trying to help you sidestep the problems posed by just a surface reading of the text. Image doesn't mean image. Likeness doesn't mean physical likeness. There's another word that means physical likeness. Don't worry about it. Elohim can mean a lot of different things. Don't be ignorant about this. Go and check another translation, and the translation will show you that in Aramaic, what we did was we use a different word, and that's what it really means. Don't just bumble through and look at the text. Keep going, because you are worried about it. I have the key to helping you figure out why you shouldn't be worried and what this really means. And this is part of why he skips around from topic to topic, is he hints around at different topics. He's not going to give the reader everything, because that's not, he says, that's not how you're supposed to learn these secrets. And he refers to this stuff as secrets or as mysteries. That's not how you're supposed to learn it. You're supposed to learn it by little flashes, a piece at a time, as you can comprehend it. And we'll see he's got a lot to say about limits on a human intellect and the ability to understand and apprehend concepts. But this is his plan. And he's, I'm starting with the stuff about image and likeness. I'm starting at the beginning of the Torah, but actually this is going to have everything to do with understanding how you read the Tanakh as a perfected, philosophically savvy, Torah observing person. This is the program, and it just comes in drips and drabs. Last week, I suggested that maybe Maimonides isn't as big of a rationalist as we are sometimes made to think. And we saw him earlier tonight reject an idea that was part of mysticism about God having a physical form. Maimonides uses ideas common to medieval philosophy and medieval mysticism. So it's useful to know that in our imaginings, mystics sit there and chant all the time and have no engagement with rational thought or anything like that. But Jewish mysticism, Christian mysticism, Islamic mysticism are all heavily engaged with with philosophy, with Greco-Roman philosophy specifically, even if they don't use those terms. So Maimonides is working in this space and time where he is working with philosophical concepts, and he's standing between Merkava mysticism, the divine chariot stuff, which gets its inspiration in part from the first chapter of Ezekiel. He's standing between that and classical Kabbalah, which hasn't fully started yet. And a Maimonides scholar, Elliot Wolfson, who also happens to be a scholar of Jewish mysticism, is talking in an article about Abraham Abulafia, who was one of the most important early Kabbalists. And he says, beyond the philological question, it can be said the most significant and pervasive approach to the Sefirot that emerges from Abulafia's voluminous corpus. Abulafia wrote 3 commentaries on the Guide of the Perplexed. We'll come back to that in a second too. Is the identification of the 10 Sefirot as the 10 separate intellects of the standard medieval Neoplatonic cosmology, Neoplatonic Aristotelian cosmology that Abulafia would have drawn most directly from Maimonides. So Maimonides is actually sitting conceptually at the beginning of Kabbalah. So at the beginning of Jewish mysticism that becomes more mainstream. And Moshe Idel is an Israeli scholar of Jewish mysticism and Jewish thought. Moshe Idel actually argues that there are 6 or 7 different Maimonides. And which Maimonides you're reading is determined by what you want to get out of Maimonides, and is in part also determined by when you're reading Maimonides in terms of when Maimonides' work was produced. Moshe Idel says Maimonides was a mystic, and he said sometime he became more skeptical about what we can know and became a little bit less mystical over time. And he spends a lot of time talking about a number of different scholars and a number of different Jewish thinkers, and he makes a point of saying Abraham Abulafia is the only person in the medieval period to write 3 commentaries on the Guide. No one else does this. There's one person who writes 2 commentaries. A bunch of people write 1. The mystic, who in theory should not be engaging in rationalist ideas, writes 3 commentaries on Maimonides. He says, isn't that very odd? Unless Maimonides is really sort of standing at the beginning of Kabbalah as a mystical tradition. And he says it's not only Abraham Abulafia. He says in the late 1700s, the early 1800s, there's another Jewish thinker, Solomon Maimon. Before Solomon Maimon becomes essentially a heretic from the perspective of Orthodox Judaism, he's a mystic too. And he says you can't understand Kabbalah without understanding Maimonides. So something about what Maimonides is up to is not divorced from Jewish mysticism, let's say, which means that he's not always doing the rationalist thing that if you were to just listen to people say Maimonides is like the first Jewish rationalist, you would think, oh, he's a rationalist. What's he doing being quoted by mystics? Because the picture is more complex. I know we're at the end of a section here, so let's stop and do questions, because people have got to be perplexed by now. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the Guide of the Perplexed. And so that I don't record your faces, I can't see your faces. So I do need you to like raise hands or put stuff in the chat. Roberto.
Hi. So I was kind of, I was a little perplexed about this. Up to this point, I think it's going to be worse from here. But I was curious about this overflowing of intellect, and without kind of any expertise, I was learning recently a little bit about the Islamic philosopher Averroes, and kind of, which seems to be a lot of similarities of what we've been learning here on not only the Aristotelian element, but also this whole view of the small elite that can understand his thought, and the rest should be just, you know, good, pious people to do their obligations, right? So it seems,
Yeah.
I don't know if it was a direct influence or just the what was being done at the day, right? But that seems so, and it has some kind of bizarre idea also about this unified intellect. That so when I was hearing about this overflowing, I don't know if he means the same thing or
Yes.
what is exactly the intention.
Yeah, he means the same thing. Averroes, Averroes is the Spanish/Latin name given to Ibn Rushd, right? So Averroes and Maimonides are almost exact contemporaries. They're, you know, within a decade of each other in terms of age, more or less. They are working on the same basic project, and they're working with the same basic assumptions about how the world works and how intellect works and how people know things, right? They're very much in sync, and they are absolutely talking about the same thing. And you are right that it has no obvious, like this is not our cognitive science, so it makes very little rational sense to us to look at it and say, oh, intelligence overflows, except it makes a ton of sense from the perspective of a mystic. And it's useful to know that Islamic philosophy, Jewish philosophy, get their start in Islamic theology, and there is some amount of overlap with Sufism in these early stages. So a lot of this stuff is cued into mysticism at the start. And there are some of these sort of things that don't work rationally necessarily to us, but seem to work for them, are just assumptions in how their universe operates. And yes, so this is absolutely the same thing as in Averroes. It is also exactly the same thing that will happen in Kabbalah, where it comes up with the idea that God retracts God's self and goodness overflows from God, and it shatters all these divine vessels, and it's overflowing out, and this is all the same process. And none of it is actually original to Islamic philosophers either, because this is what Neoplatonic philosophers were thinking about in the 1st and 2nd century CE. And this is what feeds into Christian theology. So this is where you get Trinitarianism from as well, is this idea of stuff overflowing vessels and filling people's brains. And this is all very connected stuff. This is all also 100% not philosophy as we would know it in the modern academy. People who study Plato in the modern academy and philosophy departments are essentially philologists more than they are philosophers. That person could be in the philosophy department or the classics department or the religion department, and they fit in any of them because they're not working on modern philosophical problems or using modern philosophical techniques a lot of the time. They're reading stuff in Greek or Arabic or Hebrew or whatever. And it is absolutely the same thing. Other questions? Are there people who are too perplexed to frame questions? That's okay too. Michael, you've got a hand up.
Let me just ask first about this is the period, is it not, or maybe in which the Greek texts, Aristotle, are just becoming available, isn't that right? Or is this?
So this is a little after those texts become available. Maimonides will quote Aristotle a lot. So Aristotle gets to be available like 100 years before this.
I see.
And it takes a while for Aristotle's work to latch in and get people really attached to it and figure out that it fixes some of the stuff that's maybe not quite right about Platonism.
That's not my actual. So my actual question has to do with Maimonides' interpretation of the words.
Mm-hmm.
So when we read the text, we say, oh, they had an anthropomorphic view of God in this text, right? At a certain point in Genesis, God comes kind of Adam hears God tramping through the woods or wherever, right?
Right.
He actually hears his footsteps. And there's another point where I think we talked about it in an earlier session where Moses asks God, let me see you, and God says, well, I can. And he can maybe shows his back. It's a little unclear, but God has some physical reality, and we all say, well, that was, as secularists, we can say this, that there's different views, and this kind of primitive view exists in some of the early books. But Maimonides can't say that because his view is that there is no, God is incorporeal, and the Bible is correct, and therefore the Bible has to be consistent with his views, and so he has to twist them. It's like the word rib that you talked about earlier, where they have to make the word rib mean side when it actually means rib.
Right.
So Maimonides does this over and over again with different words. And he's really just twisting it to make it to make it consistent with his views. And I'm just throwing that out. Isn't that correct, or am I missing some more esoteric point?
So Maimonides would say that, I think Maimonides would say that sometimes there is one right reading and it's not the surface reading. And sometimes the surface reading is a correct reading and there are others. And the problem becomes that you have no way of knowing except that he tells you. So that involves trying to get into his head and figure out what he meant and what he thought, which we're sort of we can't do that because he's not around to ask. He probably doesn't have the self-image of twisting these things around, just like the rabbis don't have the self-image of inventing all of rabbinic law as though it's in the Torah. So he probably doesn't have the self-image, but it certainly seems like that's what he's doing. Because he has to.
But when he uses their eyes were opened and says, oh, that's a metaphor. Well, we also see that as a metaphor. We know there was no membrane over their eyes intended, right?
Right.
So he says, so you see they're metaphors. So all these other things are really metaphors. Well, he picks the one real metaphor, kind of expand it and say, well, that's why I see. So I understand he's deluding himself in a sense from our perspective.
Yeah.
He's deluding himself, and I understand from his perspective, he's not, presumably.
Yeah. And this is one of the things that that this Moshe Idel video gets at, which, by the way, for those who are kind of hip on internet lingo, Moshe Idel actually uses an internet phrase during this lecture. He says, bring receipts. You can bring receipts for Maimonides being a mystic, he says at one point. It's like, that's interesting. Idel actually kind of says, the thing is that Maimonides changes his mind over time and he becomes skeptical about our ability to know anything. And maybe the guide has just got stuff where he changed his mind. And we have no way of knowing it because it's one big work. And that makes it even more complex because if you think about it, now I've got this 2-volume work, hundreds of pages of Arabic, and maybe he changed his mind in the middle. And now what do I do? So it all becomes very fuzzy. And the answer, I think, for a lot of it is we don't really know. And he's made it muddy by saying, I'm not going to tell you, and changing his mind in the middle, possibly. It's very weird stuff. And people make careers on, just the Guide to the Perplexed. Larry, you have a question?
Well, I was thinking along similar lines to Michael's, and to us, or to me, it seems logically simpler to say this is not a book of prophecy. Not every word is true. And God is not incorporeal. And as Michael said, people had a primitive understanding of God, which is embodied in the early works, the early books of the Torah, and they had a more sophisticated view or rabbinical view, etc. Later, that seems more logically simple. It seems, if not simpler, it seems logically consistent, as Maimonides, one of the three Maimonides, is trying to make his seem logically consistent. But we're not the first people who thought of this. David Hume thought along these lines, Spinoza thought along these lines, and probably others that I don't know. And with Michael, I'm saying, are we on the wrong track in thinking that?
I don't think we're on the wrong track thinking that. I'm going to suggest something that's slightly, vaguely controversial in the academy, vaguely. And the suggestion is this. We call Maimonides Jewish philosophy. We maybe call Spinoza Jewish philosophy too. There's a lot of people that have been called Jewish philosophy. Philo, Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, right? There's all these people that are doing Jewish philosophy. And then you look at what they have to say, and they have these limits. And these limits are not there rationally, right? They're externally imposed limits, or they're limits that they're imposing for themselves because they can't say XYZ thing isn't true, so now I have to dance around it. And there's a professor at University of Rochester who wrote a book that basically says, this thing we're calling Jewish philosophy is not philosophy, and we need to get over the idea that any of these people were doing philosophy. Because if they were doing philosophy, they would have let their rational sides guide them to say, oh no, I can't make that conclusion. But that's not what happens, right? Maimonides has to preserve the Tanakh, and so he's going to do it by finding ways around the very obvious plain text meaning. I think we have to accept that Maimonides is doing theology, not philosophy. And I think that allows us to kind of open things up a little bit more and to say, this was consistent for him, given the limits he felt like he had on what he could reason his way to before he had to stop. And I think that's probably really what we need to tag onto Maimonides is, it's not philosophy. It may have been philosophy-ish back then, but that's not philosophy now. It's not religion within the limits of reason alone. Sorry to use another Kant book. It's theology. And that explains the limits. He knows what he believes, and those are the guardrails. I think that's a more honest way of reading it rather than trying to say, oh, he's doing philosophy. Because philosophy shouldn't have those kinds of guardrails.
But his goal is to come up with a theology that's consistent with Aristotelian philosophy, because that validates the theology. Is that how you would see it?
Well, so his goal is to come up with something that is consistent with Neoplatonic. So it's actually right here, medieval Neoplatonic Aristotelian cosmology. It's not Aristotle, and it's not really Plato. It's this fusion that can be made to be consistent with some version of Torah Judaism, because it has lots of prior assumptions about how the world came into being, which is another topic that Maimonides gets into for pages and pages and pages, is how did Aristotle think the world came into being, and do we accept Aristotle's view? And that's an area where he actually doesn't accept Aristotle's view. That his backstop is, nope, God exists outside of time and created the universe and exists prior to that. And Aristotle gets at it, but in the wrong way, right? So he's not trying necessarily to say Torah, Aristotle, same. And Roberto says, but weren't those theological guardrails common to so many philosophers until the modern era? Would they not also be called philosophers? So some philosophers, yes, and some philosophers, no. Erasmus doesn't have very many guardrails. Descartes kind of doesn't have very many guardrails either, but then there are other people who do, right? So the enterprise that they're engaged in, right? If you are working with the text of the Torah and saying, the text of the Torah, my work as a philosopher is to figure out what the text of the Torah means. I'm not sure you're doing philosophy, really. Whereas if you say, I'm trying to figure out the cosmology of the world, and in my head, I'm somehow going to reconcile these things, but I'm not putting it on paper, that's a little bit more like a philosopher. Lots of people had the guardrails, but there's lots of Western philosophy that doesn't cite the New Testament. There's no Maimonides that does not cite the Torah, or the rabbis, for that matter. So, I mean, Averroes doesn't try to prove the Quran all through his Aristotelian writings. He does sometimes, he doesn't other times. Maimonides never does pure philosophy like this. So there's another project happening in Maimonides, I think, that allows him to be the forerunner of Kabbalah, even though, in theory, he is a rationalist. Well, maybe not. And this actually kind of takes us to his esotericism, right? So this is the idea that there's stuff that only certain people can understand. That's sort of the idea, the basic idea behind esotericism is, not everybody's supposed to know this stuff. And Maimonides was clear when we looked at his introduction, only certain people, right? So if you've only been schooled in the formal study of the law, you shouldn't be reading this because you're not well informed enough. If you're new to philosophical speculation, you shouldn't read it because it's going to mislead you. And he asserts this not because of ego or not only ego, right? I think you have to have very significant ego to do some of this stuff that Maimonides does, right? You're the doctor to the Sultan, and you run the Jewish community, and you're writing a completely new approach to Jewish law, and you're writing a completely new approach to Jewish thought. There's some ego there. But the esotericism isn't only ego. He has this understanding of the limits on intellect. And he says, look, know that the human intellect has objects of apprehension that is within its power and according to its nature to apprehend. There are things your brain can understand. On the other hand, in that which exists, there are also extents and matters that, according to its nature, it is not capable of apprehending in any way or through any cause. The gates of their apprehension are shut before it. There are things you can understand, and there are things humans cannot understand. This is not the Maimonides of 20 years before who thinks that he can understand everything, by the way. This is another part of Moshe Idel's talk. There are also, in that which exists, things of which the intellect can apprehend one state and not others. There are great differences in capacity between individuals. It may thus happen that whereas one individual discovers a certain notion, again, idea, not, dismissive word notion, discovers a certain notion by himself through a speculation, another individual is not able ever to understand that notion. And he says, this isn't because the Torah says this that I'm telling you this. It's something that has already been said and truly grasped by the philosophers without their having concern for particular doctrine or opinion. We have put this chapter before others only with a view to its serving as an introduction to that which shall come after. So he's introducing a whole section of the guide that's about what people can and can't understand and what you should or shouldn't teach them. And I'm introducing this issue by telling you minds are limited. Individual people's intellects are limited, and there are just limits on what any human can understand. And we're going to run up against them. This is part of what he's saying, is we're going to run up against the limits of intellect. You who study my treatise know, right? So remember, he started with this letter to somebody and he says, you, and he's making the second person address here again. You who study my treatise know that something similar to what happens to sensory apprehensions happens likewise to intellectual apprehensions. You see with your eye, you apprehend something within your power to apprehend, but if you're forced to do something, you can't. See something over a great distance, or look at very small writing or a drawing, and your eye simply can't see the details, and you force your eye to do it, your eye gets not only too weak to see the thing you're trying to force it to see, but also you can't do anything else with your eyes, right? So you sit in front of a computer screen going like this for too long, and all of a sudden your eyes are fuzzy for the rest of the day. That's the phenomenon he's talking about, although not with a computer screen. A similar discovery is made by everyone engaging in the speculative study of some science with respect to his state of reflection. He sets himself to reflection, sets himself a task, becomes dull and doesn't understand even that which he could understand, right? So you work too hard at something and you confuse yourself about everything. For the condition of all bodily faculties is in this respect one and the same. Your eyes, your brain, your ears, everything works like this, he says. You are capable of overextending yourself. And when you do that, you actually undermine all of your other abilities as well. So he's saying, intellect isn't equally proportioned among people, and there's harm in trying to understand that. Understand the stuff that you can't understand. And he illustrates it with something in the Talmud. So this is, some folks will have encountered this before. So this is the story of 4 sages. So the sages taught, 4 entered into Pardes, the garden, whatever it is. 4 entered into Pardes, and these are they: Shimon ben Azai, Shimon ben Zoma, Acher, Elisha ben Abuya is Acher, and Rabbi Akiva. And Akiva said to them before they went in, when you reach the stones of pure marble, don't say water, water. There's no good explanation for this passage, by the way. Don't say water, water, because it is stated, one who speaks lies shall not be established before my eyes. Then Azai glimpsed and died. So the idea that the Talmud, that the commentators say is, well, Azai glimpsed God in heaven and died. And concerning him, scripture says, precious in the eyes of the Lord is the death of his pious ones. Ben Zoma glimpsed and was harmed, which is to say, he went insane. And concerning him, scripture says, have you found honey? Eat enough for you, lest you fill up and vomit it out. Acher pulled up shoots, which is to say, he became a heretic. Rabbi Akiva went out in peace, /whole, and oh, by the way, is martyred later. So this text in the Talmud is traditionally understood to be, don't do mysticism. You may not know what you're doing, and it's dangerous. And Maimonides cites this text, and he says, if you stay your progress because of a dubious point, if you do not deceive yourself into believing that there's a demonstration, if you do not hasten to reject and categorically pronounce false any assertions whose contradictories have not been demonstrated, if finally you do not aspire to apprehend that which you are unable to apprehend, you will have achieved human perfection and attained the rank of Rabbi Akiva, peace be upon him, who entered in peace and went out in peace. When you are engaged in the theoretical study of these metaphysical matters, there are limits. And when you hit your limit, don't keep going. Stop. Don't think you can disprove what's right, or what's right. Don't think that something that's false can be proved. When you hit your limit, that's how you know that you've gotten as far as you can. Because if you try to do that, you will become a heretic. So he has limits. He very clearly seems to think if you go too far in your speculation, you're going to become a heretic. You need to know your limits. And when you hit your limit, you're done. You are perfect. To the extent you can be perfected, you have reached that point. So it's not clear what this water stuff is in the Talmudic text. I looked at commentaries for about 3 hours today. There's just not any good stuff out there to really explain it until you start getting into Hasidic thought, and then you're 1,200 years after the Talmud, and that's not useful really from a historical setting. But he clearly believes that there are limits to human intellect, and this text that everybody in rabbinic tradition understands as guiding mysticism is the text he uses to say you have limits to what you can understand. And Maimonides says the rabbis are pointing this out. The intention of these texts set down by the prophets and sages is not to wholly close the gate of speculation. The ignorant and neglectful think that that's what this text is for. The purpose is to make it known that intellects of human beings have a limit at which they stop. You have to know when to stop. He's saying that's what the rabbis are trying to get at with this story. Don't criticize the terms applied to the intellect in this chapter and others, for the purpose here is to guide toward the intended notion and not investigate the truth of the essence of the intellect. There are other chapters about that. He says, I'm trying to give you a lesson here. Don't take it for more than it's worth. I'm not really fully talking about intellect here. I'm just trying to tell you not to go too far, that there's a limit and you should know where your limit is. And somehow the limit is coterminous with some of the criteria for mysticism. However, there are things that everybody should understand, no matter who they are. Don't think that all I've talked about with how difficult the hidden nature is to understand and the limits on intellect, that people can get away with not understanding that God has no body. Just as it behooves us to bring up children in the belief and to proclaim to the multitude that God, may he be magnified and honored, is one, and that none but he ought to be worshipped, so it behooves that they should be made to accept on traditional authority. You don't have to teach them philosophy, you just have to teach them Torah. The belief that God is not a body, and that there is absolutely no likeness in any respect whatever between him and the things created by him, and that his existence has no likeness to theirs, nor his life to the life of those among them who are alive, nor again his knowledge to the knowledge of those among whom they are endowed with knowledge. It's a hard concept to understand, but you still have to get people to believe this, even if you're not going to teach them philosophy because they can't understand it. So there are limits to the limits to the limits, right? We still have to teach this particular concept somehow. And he says that there's enough in the Torah to make it work so that people believe the right thing. But there are limits to what you can know. And he actually says at one point, mathematics is complete and we understand all of it. How many of you have taken a math class and thought, oh yeah, we can totally understand all of this, right? There are all these unsolvable problems in mathematics today. Clearly we don't understand all of it. So esoteric or not, Maimonides thinks that there's a lot of stuff that isn't really for consumption except for a few people. He's clear that he thinks that because it's harmful. He says, this isn't really from philosophers. Some philosophers have this sort of esoteric thing, but not all of them. But really it's from Jewish mystical traditions and biblical and rabbinic texts, and there's a limit as to what you can limit people to, that you have to teach some fundamental ideas. God is one, God has no body, God can't be described, God's intelligence is not like others' intelligence, right? There are limits. And yet there's a lot we will not teach you. So there is this sort of special group that he thinks can understand these things. And if you were with us for Spinoza, you'll remember that Spinoza thought this too. That he said, oh yeah, there's a lot of people that are just not going to be able to understand this. It's for them that we have the Bible, because they need something to teach them how to be good people. But, you know, we philosophers, we can understand this. We don't really need the Bible to tell us how to be a good person. Right? That's something that's happening in Spinoza. It's happening in Maimonides. It also happens in Philo in the 1st century CE, but Jews mostly don't know Philo because Philo was written in Greek. It just didn't get a lot of reading in the Jewish world until 1700s. Okay, so questions. There's everybody's brain just melted. It's okay if that's true.
Well, going back a few steps, and I think after going to the end with you is very interesting, but going back a few steps to Maimonides is doing theology, not philosophy, I think that was very enlightening to me. That made a lot of sense. What I think that for us secular Jews, we have a theology that God's existence is not proven at best, and that science is true. And I think it's difficult, if not impossible, for us to put ourselves in the shoes of someone who believes the opposite of those two things. And so I think we're in our little sheep pen as well, as Maimonides, and we should, if that's true, we should be aware of it and be a little humble.
Well, so I'm going to zip over the can you describe God stuff in Maimonides for a second. Because there's a slide here. As humanistic Jews, there are some questions we should be asking. Maimonides asserts there are things that cannot be apprehended. Is he right? You know, one of the fundamental things that happens with humanism is we say science can understand stuff. That's how we understand the world, and science continues to progress and learn more stuff, and eventually we'll figure out everything. Maimonides says that's not going to happen. Is he right? You know, science seems like magic. You know, what's the difference between magic and science, right? Is it Isaac Asimov who kind of said, you know, look,
Bradbury.
Magic, Bradbury, right? That science, what science looks like magic from the right perspective, right? Can beliefs be true if they aren't fully demonstrated? Or is this a dodge? Is Maimonides trying to avoid the fact that he can't prove stuff? Or do we have beliefs that can't be fully demonstrated and we should assume that they're true? Right? So this is actually some of the stuff, Larry, that you're bringing up is stuff that I wanted us to think about after getting through some of the Maimonides stuff, is how do we, as humanistic Jews, what is reason and how does it work, and how does science interact with all of this, and what does that mean? And how confident are we that some of Maimonides' conclusions aren't the right ones? How confident are we that our conclusions are the right ones? Are we functioning in are we doing scientism, right? So there's this idea that there's a thing called scientism, which is, oh, you think that science is a religion, right? And that's an unfair smear against a lot of humanists. But should we remain aware that maybe we do that sometimes? And is Maimonides somehow something that we can draw on to address that? So Maimonides, right? Okay. Larry, you were going where I was going at the end, which is, okay, what about this? And what does it say to us as a, you know, we're coming close to the high holidays. We should be doing some introspection, and maybe we can introspect on this a little bit. You know, what is it that we think our project is, and what his project was, and are we that different? Yes or no? How? And studying some of the ways that, to us, he seems to contort himself in order to get at a conclusion can be instructive. To say nothing of the fact that I've got, like, you know, 12 slides on exactly how Maimonides tries to explain that you can say God has characteristics, but you can't actually say God has characteristics. Other questions? it's the guide to the perplexed. So if you're perplexed, that's good. It means that the guide did its job. Joyce.
It's not about guide to becoming perplexed.
I don't really have a question except to say that, you know, when he talks about reaching your intellectual limit and not going beyond that, I'm beginning to feel like I've arrived there tonight, because a lot of this stuff is just really deep and hard to wrap one's head around.
So I will tell you that when we wrapped up last week, my mom was in that session. She's not in this one. She's helping my sister move. She sent me a text message and she said, I am clearly not one of the people Maimonides was writing for. So I think that's a common feeling. Michael, you've got a hand up.
Yeah, like Larry, I was really taken by your comment that Maimonides is doing theology and not philosophy. But then I would go ahead and say, I think many philosophers, and maybe you already said this, are doing theology but not philosophy, in the sense that philosophy, and you know, you're a student of philosophy. I'm just a cursory knowledge person, but it seems to me that philosophy, starting with Descartes and moving on, it was invented to in a sense pretend that we can come up with the same answers that religion came up with. What does it mean to be a good person? Through reason. Now that's false. I'm just going to state flat out that that's false. Okay? And therefore philosophy is false, and simply pretending the categorical imperative, Spinoza's idea of what how salvation is, all of that is stuff that they started off with and worked to, pretending to use reason. And again, their own self-image wasn't that they were pretending, but you can pick Spinoza apart and show logically it's not, Spinoza's not logical. His ethics, which is a logical system, is not logical, and could have come up with a totally different answer. But he came up with the answer that he wanted to because the religious tradition had always come up with this answer, and Kant is the same thing. And he needed to develop this huge edifice of gobbledygook, which we call philosophy, to come up with a simple answer that religion always just said because God said. So that's my, and I'll go beyond that. And yes, I, on the notion of whether my personal view is, yes, there are things we cannot understand, you know, and I know people don't like, you know, what is sentience, you know, how, I put it this way, how can atoms and molecules feel? Mm-hmm. I would argue that it may be that our brains, which were constructed, evolved to enable us to survive in a conditions very different from the ones we live in. And to me, it's shocking that we can do algebra, much less calculus. Why would we be able, because there was no reason to be able to do those things. Why should we be able to understand the nature of feeling, intellect, thought, these God overflowing, whatever? Why should we be able to reach that in a rational way with our pea brains or little pea brains?
Right. So what's interesting about philosophy is that I think there's a thing that happens in philosophy. It's mostly in the 20th century. It's a little bit in the 19th century, where philosophy starts to figure out what it's actually good at. And what philosophy is really good at is saying, not, this is how you know things. This is how we know what's right and wrong or whatever else. It gets really good at forcing other disciplines to explain how they know things. And once you kind of stop and take a look at modern philosophy as doing that, it gets a lot more useful because it's not trying to build an edifice, right? You know, the ethics. Pick your ethics, right? Aristotle's ethics, Spinoza's ethics, whatever. Like, how do you know this stuff? the overflowing intelligence that Roberto talked about earlier, right? How do we know all of this stuff? They don't know all of this stuff. It's not provable. But when you get to the mid 20th century and people start saying, how do you know? And you get a discipline like philosophy of science and philosophy of history and all of these things, then you're getting philosophy that starts to actually do something that philosophy is good at, right? Because it starts to put reason out there, put logic out there in a particular way. Even when there are philosophers who are coming to conclusions that are different from religious ones, right? Hegel, as a philosopher, is not coming to traditional religious conclusions about the way the world works, but he's still building a conceptual edifice. And at the end of the day, it's like, okay, well, this is an interesting tool, but, right, this dialectical thing that he has, and it's what helps build Marxism. But Marxism has a particular view of how the world is supposed to work too, and what happens when it doesn't work that way. Is it wrong? So, yeah, philosophy has this thing where it tries to build stuff, and that's not where philosophy is necessarily at its best. And part of what happens from the Enlightenment forward is that the things that were all part of philosophy start getting peeled away and not being part of philosophy anymore, right? Mathematics gets pulled away from philosophy by Newton and Leibniz, and we get calculus. And astronomy gets pulled away by Copernicus and Galileo, and it's not part of philosophy anymore because you have lenses that can see things and you can figure out the movement of things, and oh, maybe these 9 interlocking spheres that the Greeks had is the wrong system. And Peter has typed in the chat box, people like me who are not scientists have no choice to assume that science will be correct. So we have no better information than anyone else. Right? It's a problem. We have to make assumptions. Okay, but Barry, why what?
No, he says it, so we really have no better information than anybody else. I don't know, does he mean that we're talking about science? Like with COVID? Are we saying that the scientists don't have better information about how to deal with COVID than anybody else?
No. The point is that non-scientists have no better information than anyone else. And we're left sort of saying, okay, well, we're going to hope that scientists know what they're talking about. You're making, I don't want to call it a leap of faith, like a Kierkegaard leap of faith, but I'm not a scientist. I think science is great. I have no idea really how to evaluate scientific material to know who's right and who's not.
Yeah, agreed.
I mean, and that's Peter's point is, I'm not a scientist. How do I know? I just have to like put faith in science? And then if I do, is that a religious jump?
No.
Essentially.
No, it's not a religious jump. Because if you come up with contradictory information, that goes against what that a particular scientist or a particular theory, then you're willing to give it up. And that's the difference. And we do that all the time. And scientists do that all the time.
I mean, scientists do that all the time, but
so do people.
Okay, but we know that. So, we know that physics isn't what you learn in high school, right? Actual physics isn't what I learned in high school.
Well,
how do I know? Right? I learned Newtonian physics. That's what they taught in high school.
Yes.
But we know it's much more complicated than that. And somebody mentioned, oh, the Einstein exists, and none of the stuff is maybe actually right. But what it's difficult to assess it. And so to a great degree, people who aren't scientists are left to hope it's right,
Yeah. So essentially what it comes down to is that these are all useful approximations for making predictions. And the fact that Newtonian physics really is not the way the world works, for most of the things that we do, it's useful for making predictions. And the same thing with Einsteinian physics is that for these more esoteric things, so far it's actually been very good at making predictions. And as long as that continues to be true, then we continue to use it. But as soon as we stop being able to, satisfy predictions, then we start looking for other things.
Right,
I
and
also,
that's the
I also
process
agree
of
with Michael.
science.
Right. That's just the process of science. I also agree with Michael that there are probably things that we cannot comprehend. I mean, I don't think anybody can comprehend quantum physics. What they do is they have equations that they use for making predictions. It's not that they understand in some, like that. I don't think that we are capable of understanding that something is both a wave and a particle. We accept it. Someone says it, all right, it enables us to make predictions about things. But it's not clear to me that people actually comprehend it. And the other question you have is, can beliefs be true if they can't be fully demonstrated? Well, that's what Gödel showed, that there are things which can be true, which cannot be demonstrated. So that's been known since what, the 30s, certainly at least mathematically. If it's true mathematically, it's probably true for everything else.
Yeah, but would we have had this discussion if we hadn't tried to pick apart Maimonides and figure out what he was doing?
Right. No, I'm not saying it's not useful. Yeah, it's useful. But I think what's important is that Maimonides is making this attempt to make Judaism more rational. And the things that he accepts on faith, he's trying to make it less. He's trying to, I guess, cut down the things he's keeping on faith.
Yeah. I mean, you're saying Peter's chat, right? So scientists tell us they revise their conclusions. Do we have information to enable us to believe if they did the revisions? I mean,
if they did it correctly, and the answer is, well, you should be skeptical. Say, okay, this is different, but does it work? I mean, in a sense, the main thing about science is power. The power to predict. And if something happens that gives you increased power, then we say, well, this is a better approximation of how the world is. But really what happened, what we see is just a construct of our minds. It's not clear exactly how it squares the reality. I mean, just as a simple example, flowers have, on their petals, have things that absorb ultraviolet light. And bees see that, and it gives particular patterns, but we don't see that. So we have an approximation of what's going on out there, but it's not clear that it's identical with what is outside us. Well, in fact, I would say it's not. It probably is not. It's just a mental construct.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, because I want to make sure that I'm respecting everybody's time, and I'm going to assume that people are now probably physically exhausted, if not mentally exhausted. Are there any other conclusions? Any other questions? You can have conclusions too. That's fine. Or would you need like 5 more hours of just going through the slides that we went through to start to kind of deal with some of this stuff?
No, I think you did a nice job, and I appreciate it. So I'm satisfied. At this moment, it's not clear to me I need to do more.
Fair enough. If folks want the slides, I'm perfectly happy to send them. There's a whole section here that we didn't really get to, which is sort of the famous discussion of how you can't say positive things about God, so any positive thing you say is actually the inverse of its negative, and Nadine says maybe 5 more years to read everything we need to understand it all. Yeah. I can't really recommend sitting down and starting the Guide of the Perplexed at page 1 and going through to the end, because it's not an exciting read. I mean, you've seen it's not an exciting read, and the translation is a little contorted. I'd love to see a more modern plain text translation, but it's unlikely we're going to get it now that University of Chicago's figured out how to turn this thing into a Kindle book. I think this is the one we're stuck with until copyright law public domain does a public domain with the translation, and then somebody will translate it again, I guess. Okay, so I see Roberto would like the slides. If anybody else wants the slides, let me know.
Yeah, I'd like to make a suggestion, and that is, yeah, could you make the meeting, the Zoom meeting, a recurring meeting, and so that we always have the same link?
Yeah, so I had done that initially, and then we got Zoom bombed, and I'm trying to kind of balance all of that stuff. So I've continually kind of rethink that. So it may happen again when we trust the distribution of things. So some folks have said they'd like another session to go through the via negativa stuff, all of this stuff. What is God anyway, is what I called this section. So maybe I'll have to think about how we do that. I need to think about the timing on it, actually. So let me give some thought to that. And in the interim, I will send out the slides to folks who are interested in slides.